Hello and welcome to this lovely Story from the Stage session. We're coinciding with the end of COP26, coming together during Eden's Festival of Discovery, which is all about working together for our planet. The climate emergency is a huge problem that requires us to collaborate and use our skills and creativity and determination too. And on that note, I'm delighted to welcome two really brilliant people who are both bringing their creativity and skills together to meet this challenge. I'm welcoming Matt Bell, Chair of Woolwich Contemporary Print Fair and co-creator of the Young London Print Prize with Izzys from Boldface. First, I'm going to invite Matt to just tell us a little bit about the Woolwich Print Fair, and then I'm going to invite Izzys back to join us for a further discussion. So thanks for joining us both today. Really, really excited and delighted to have you both with us. So first, Matt, can you give us a little bit of an intro to yourself and to the Woolwich Print Fair?
Of course, Sarah. It's really nice to be here. Woolwich Contemporary Print Fair is an art fair which I set up with an artist and curator back in 2015. And what we're trying to do is showcase the best printmakers in the world and help people learn about and collect and create prints. Printmaking is interesting because it's quite it's a very historic and quite subversive art form. And it's got a huge history of, if you think about most revolutions in the Western world, were started through the medium of printmaking. It's how we've always distributed on the cheap ideas and changed behaviours and got people to kind of see the world in different ways. And that's part of what we're trying to do with the Woolwich Contemporary Print Fair.
Fantastic. And so just on that, it's been running for a couple of days already in the physical space, hasn't it, in Woolwich?
Yeah, so we run it for 4 days every year in November, physically, in an old historic building in Woolwich, down in southeast London. And then it goes online. It continues live for the next couple of weeks. So if you're interested, I think we'll put something in the chat so you can actually take a look and see. And there's artists from all over the world exhibiting, all different kinds of printmaking, doing some really beautiful, interesting work, which is helping us imagine a different kind of world.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I had the very great privilege of being able to go and actually see the physical space just a couple of days ago. And I have to say, I was hugely impressed by the quality of work that you have on display there. Such a massive variety. Really, really very excited to hear that it's actually virtual so other people can enjoy it wherever they are, and which is so great given that this is a virtual festival that we're taking part in. So on that note, I'm actually going to invite Izzys to come back in here and just give us a little bit of an intro to yourself as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having us. My name's Izzys. I'm an artist, an art writer, and an arts educator. And I run a small community interest company called Boldface, and we essentially do projects with young people that kind of elevate their work into a kind of professional realm. So whether that's a podcast or a film or an art exhibition, it's a means of kind of platforming young voices through the medias that we already that we as adults and as young people in the digital world see things all the time anyway. So that's kind of what we do. And yeah, Matt and I co-founded the Young London Print Prize together, which has run for 2 years and has just kind of gone from strength to strength. So it's been really nice.
Yeah. And just before we kind of go into further detail on that, can I just ask you the question? So Matt, I think it was you who said that you're proposing that the climate emergency is a cultural problem as much as it is a scientific one, and that actually it's kind of, art and climate art that can help kind of drive that conversation to an extent. Can I just ask you the question, what actually is climate art from your perspective?
Yeah, so my take on a lot of the debate that's gone on at COP over the last 2 weeks, and actually the way we've approached the whole climate crisis over the last 10 or 15 years, is that it's been deeply technocratic. And that'll absolutely nail on a way to solve half of the problem and not begin to touch the rest. So a lot of the problem with climate change, isn't it? It's about our behaviours, it's about what we aspire to, it's about our own identity and how we perceive ourselves. So you might come up with all sorts of amazing ways to deal with the technical issues, but actually what we need to address are those questions about culture and behavior and aspiration. And art is one of the best tools we have at our disposal to do that. Now, there's quite a long history of climate art going back over 20 or 30 years or so. There's a picture, actually, which I wondered if we could just put up and show people, and I'll use that to illustrate. So this is a work of art by a Chinese artist, and that's Shanghai in the background. And it was produced in 2014, and it's called The Ninth Wave. And I think it's an amazing image, but it's also, for me, it's quite problematic, because it's essentially quite an apocalyptic image of the impact of the climate crisis on our lives. So you've got a boat there with Shanghai in the background, looking pretty urban and pretty dark and pretty inhospitable, and a boat coming past and he put 99 life-size replicas of dying animals on it. And you see in the middle, just above it, there's a white flag from the boat. And in Chinese culture, white flags, the white is associated with funerals and death. In a Western civilization, it's associated with surrender. So a lot of the initial artistic responses to the climate crisis were very doom-laden. And that had a message which I think can shock and horrify, but it's quite a problematic way if you're trying to inspire the future. And what we're reaching for with things like the Young London Print Prize, which we'll come on to, is a different kind of climate art, which paints a picture, maybe literally, of the world that we could create. And it's trying to get people to engage artistically with the issue and optimistically, and create something which the public will actually want to be a part of in a way that I don't think they've engaged yet. And no amount of pathways and targets are going to get most people there.
That's really interesting, actually, because actually what you've articulated there is this kind of tension that exists between, communicating and engaging with the issue, so the challenge that we face, and actually the solutions, which is about the vision and actually kind of projecting forward in a hopeful way. Izzy, do you have any perspective on that to add in terms of what your kind of experience has seen and your understanding around the topic of climate art and what it is to you and to others?
Yeah, sure. I think what I think is really interesting is that we kind of have this term, like Matt says, climate art, that emerged kind of in the late 60s, 70s, when activists and artists started coming together to make work on the kind of topic of environmentalism. But what's really interesting in terms of art history is that we as a human species have always made work about our relationship to nature, from ancient Japanese printmaking through to the European romantics, who I think there was a really interesting connection to environmentalism in terms of romantic painters, because they were really interested in this notion of the sublime. And that was a notion that encapsulated the power of nature, the all-encompassing power of nature, which for them was to do with God. But still, I think there's this kind of really interesting dichotomy to do with how we've, as human species, have always seen ourselves separate from nature in some capacity, and how in the sublime, that notion of kind of beauty and terror coming together, that kind of also iterates this idea that we're looking at, okay, so we need to accept a very dangerous and scary looking future because of what we're doing to the earth. But at the same time, we need to make a future that's beautiful. We need to imagine a future that's beautiful in order to be able to avoid that and to give people agency to do something, because if everything's all doom and gloom, then it creates apathy. So yeah, I think there's just lots of richness in terms of climate art, but also prior to that, kind of nature and how that's represented throughout history.
It's really interesting, actually, when you think about looking, back through time at art that does show that connection, or our kind of relationship with nature. And you look at the kind of very early cave paintings, and actually how the kind of expressions of nature were absolutely intrinsic to those, in terms of, everything from, the kind of creatures that were part of their landscape at that time, And actually over time and charting art, as you've mentioned it, and how that kind of relationship has evolved, actually there's the kind of idea that, climate art representing the issues now is of our moment and of our time, in terms of, picking up on what's happening around us to a degree. But actually, in order to find solutions, it's about looking forward and kind of creating that vision. And Matt, and I was just wondering, we talked about the kind of role that climate art has to play, and certainly, in COP26, as that draws to a close, we look back at Paris, where art played a more key role. And how do you think art has been utilized in the kind of narrative around COP, and has that been done effectively, do you think?
Hardly at all, and no would be my really short answer to that.
Yeah.
I think it's I'm not in the kind of doom and gloom camp about the last 2 weeks. Is it enough? Not at all. About the bigger picture, but there's been some progress now, so I don't think we should be downhearted about that. But as a civic event or experience, and one which puts art and culture anywhere near the centre stage, it's not even begun to cut that at all. So that's and in a way that Paris clearly did. So as a city, it embraced that festival. The whole COP felt much more public than this one. Whereas essentially, I think what we've had is a debate amongst the professional and political class behind a barrier, and they've made some progress, but that's what's happened. So I hope that looking forward, we can begin to, and particularly actually at a local level. So I think one of the things that art can do as a medium to engage people in your neighbourhood, on your street, in your borough, in your city, art and culture is a brilliant way to draw people into and make mainstream the things that all of us who are passionate in the environmental movement want to make real. Art is like an amazing magnet to pull people into these issues and debates and give them a kind of sense of the possibility.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that kind of, capturing people's imaginations, connecting with people, engaging people in the conversation. It's through the kind of, cultural engagement that will kind of elevate it to another level. And just moving on now, Izzy, and perhaps I can come to you on this. How do you see that, that in terms of the work that you're doing on the Young London Print Prize, then, in terms of engaging young minds in this space, and the role and the power that they have and giving them a voice?
Yeah, I mean, I think, since environmental action has become a thing, so since kind of the 60s, 70s, I think the main focus has been to change the paradigm, to change the ultimate way that we think about things. We had an amazing seminar the other day where we were talking about the relationship of art and activism. And I've actually been thinking a lot since then about activism is constantly seen as kind of like a separate thing from society, or environmentalism is seen as a singular issue, something that exists on its own terms, separate from everything else. Obviously, needless to say, it's always linked up within race, class, the systems of power that we have across the world. It's environmentalism encompasses all of those things. But I think in terms of changing a paradigm, if you start to do that at a young age, so if you bring these topics through art, which I can go on to talk about a little bit more, but through art is a really useful way. It's a very effective way of talking about things. Then you create a kind of a norm. It's just a norm, and it's not a topic. It's not a singular issue. It's a foundation which you build on. And what is amazing about young people is that is what you're creating when you're working with young people. You're creating young minds, and you kind of have access to enable that change in paradigm. So do you see?
Yeah. So do you see then that through your experience working with young people that there has been a very clear mindset shift? Because actually what you're describing there is, you know, embedding within their consciousness a very different attitude in terms of how they express themselves. Have you actually noticed that has been expressed by the sort of feedback that you've had from young people taking part?
Absolutely. I mean, at the ceremony that we had for the prize giving for the prize last week, I mean, some of the stuff that they're saying is incredible. And you know, I'm not that old. You know, I haven't even done my full 3 decades yet in life, just coming up to it. But regardless, in my short time that I've lived on this planet, I see an enormous difference between even my generation, the generation above me, and the generation below me. And I think for all of the problems and things that you're faced with, on how difficult and how endlessly knotted all of the issues of social injustice across the entire world are, which is just so fat and stifling and difficult, there is hope in the fact that there is fundamental shifts in perspective over time.
Yeah, I think that point is really, really key actually around this kind of notion of empowerment and hope and creating a sense of agency. You know, in terms of the artworks being produced, Matt, have you, you know, looking at the kind of artworks that these young people are producing, have you seen a kind of sense of agency, empowerment, and hopefulness coming through in the work?
We can have a look at a couple of them in a minute. Yes, but I wouldn't want to go over the top. If you see what I mean. So I think I think I'd expected to see a lot more dead turtles and kind of factories pumping out emissions and things. And what was really interesting in the art that the young people produced, so these are all 10 and 11-year-olds, years 5 and 6, from London primary schools. And the brief we gave them was to say, look, we want you to express your personal response to the climate crisis through the medium of printmaking. And I think if you ask that question of a lot of adults, they would be completely flummoxed. So this is a young 10-year-old from a school here in Woolwich, and she responded to that question immediately. It didn't worry her at all. She took it on the chin, right, got on with it. And with the arts educators and her classmates, they began to use acetate-based monoprinting to be able to create some really interesting abstract responses to the climate crisis. And some of them were quite optimistic. Some of them were very pragmatic. Most of them were really beautiful. But I think they were expressions of where they already were as individuals, which we enabled them to express through the medium of printmaking. And so what it almost does is speak as much from their generation to ours as change their generation. So it's not like we're going in there and they're in a bad place and we're using art to enable them to kind of suddenly find the promised land. They're very comfortable with environmental discussions. They're not so deep and dark about it as we might be. And they can use art to begin to bring that alive in all sorts of interesting and surprising ways. So the potential here for like an intergenerational conversation, you know, like really good youth work, it's partly about the young people. It's partly about connecting older and younger people and creating a conversation. So it's done that immaculately. Can we look at the next slide? Would that be, we can begin to talk through?
The art, absolutely.
And Izzy, do you want to talk to this one? So these are our young curators who judged it all.
So this is the section. We have kind of 4 phases of the prize. Initially, we work with teachers to see how we can kind of help support them use art within their curriculum, which is obviously very pressed and often not a lot of time for. Then we deliver workshops in schools. That's the second phase. And this here, what you've got, the image here is the third phase, which is where we convene and we have a kind of a set. Well, this year we had a kind of 2-day professional development day course with 16 to 18-year-olds. And the final task that they have to do after a number of different kind of workshops and kind of trips and stuff like that is to actually judge the prize, which is quite a wild task because there was literally 1,000 submissions and only 3 winners. One winner.
That's incredible. 1,000.
Yeah, it was fascinating. You know, it's really fascinating. We kind of went through a very, direct democracy in action, like just very kind of, and I think there's a lot of richness to talk about and critique how that actually operates. But I think what's really interesting about that process and doing that with the young people is that we see like a small microcosm of power, and we actually see these microcosms of how power actually works, which I think is really interesting in terms of like actually judging the prize. I think it's also really important to mention that like a lot of the workshops that we do with the young people are, well, first of all, to the young people as in the young curators, so they're 16 to 18. We do lots of workshops in terms of like looking at art and looking at art critically. This year we actually did an amazing workshop on the Zabudovic collection, which there's been a long boycott for that because of its ties to Israeli arms. So we had like an incredible session on that where we kind of looked at those things very openly and very critically, and had a really incredible open discussion, and learnt a lot from the kind of case study of that, and also just kind of as a lesson in criticality and holistic criticality, where we're looking at issues as like together, things being together. How does art here affect the rest of the world? Does it affect the rest of the world? How does what we do make a difference? Asking these very big questions, very directly, very explicitly, and creating an open space to talk about those things is really integral. So I bring that up, and because it's kind of in line with, everything being interconnected, as is the case with environmentalism.
So it sounds like during the prize, that actually these young people are getting to experience, lots of different areas of learning, and a different kind of experience of what art and art expression is, and actually kind of the practice as well. That the idea that young people might see, producing a piece of art as being the finished, product. But actually, do you think that this process is helping them to have a different relationship with the creation of art?
Yeah, for sure. And that's really one of our key focuses, is to, I think you find a lot when you're working with kind of primary age, they're really preoccupied with creating something that looks like something, which can be it can really stunt your development and your modes of expression. So yeah, we definitely, and that was why we looked at an abstract artist this year called Heather Day, who creates her work all while she's out in unaltered nature, and she kind of turns the rhythm of rivers or the sounds of stones into mark making, and it creates abstract work. So that was a very deliberate choice of workshop, because it's to do with our relationship and our immersion in nature, us not being separate, actually a part of it, but through a mode of expression that is not dependent on something looking like something. So yeah, I think that's
really interesting. And then in terms of kind of how you went, I mean, you talked about the print prize, kind of participants actually being part of the judging process to actually decide. I mean, God, to choose winners must have been so difficult. Matt, can I ask you, what were you actually kind of involved in that at all, facilitating, and what was that like? The kind of tension and the buzz in the room must have been incredible.
Well, it was a complete flipping nightmare, as democracy always is. So we had 1,000 submissions. So we've run this. It's only 2 years old, and part of what I'm interested in doing this event with is just to try and inspire other people to do similar things and maybe to grow this too. So we've had 1,000 young people in. Could we show the next slide? Because it'll show the agony of democracy. So I've gone through all the prints. So this is the 3 top prize winners.
Very cool.
With a lovely pic. So it's Meryl in the middle. She's 10. She's from a Thamesmead primary school. There's Mohammed on the left, who came second, and Zara on the right, who came third.
Yeah.
And then the slide after this, just one more if we could. So this is the prize that came second, which I think is a stunning piece of work. So we've got at Woolwich Contemporary Print Fair, we've got 500 of the best printmakers in the world. If I slip this in the exhibition amongst their work, I don't think anybody would blink, and poor Mohammed would probably make quite a lot of money. Poor guy. This is
really beautiful,
isn't it? It's lovely. So it's a very mature work. What I mean, and the titles were really interesting in terms of young people's attitude to the climate crisis. So this one he'd entitled "Land of Peace," which is really interesting. So and you can think I'm not quite sure where he was going with that. It's interesting, but lots of them had, and the one that won was a piece of art called "Climate Love." Really interesting. So lots of the kind of the apocalyptic view of the climate crisis was not where a lot of them were at.
No.
And they were expressing their relationship to the environment and the climate in quite a pragmatic way, as well as a very creative response to it. So that for me was really interesting. And the judging, the young curators did a brilliant job. You picked 3. Were they the best? Heaven knows, is in the eye of the beholder to a certain extent. But that point about the ability of young people to respond to the climate in a very confident, familiar way. I think that's just the logo for. We don't want to worry about that. But they were very capable of doing it. It didn't flummox them. They're hugely literate in environmental issues, creatively and politically. And that you walk away from that just so hopeful, because you think, God, they're starting out from such a capable position. And if we can empower them to be able to sit in the box seat, then I've become quite hopeful.
Yeah. And do you think that we can, sorry, I was just going to say, do you think that we can take any lessons from our young people who are kind of taking, the approach forward in this way, Izzy?
I mean, yeah, of course. Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's yes is my answer. I think that, I don't know if this answers your question, but I was just thinking about the notion of a contribution. The Young London Print Prize is a contribution. It's not going to save the world, and it's not going to do this, thing. But if, as we see in change throughout history, social movements and stuff, where hopefully it's lessened the suffering of not only people, but, the planet, which is what we're moving towards, it's when contributions start to accumulate. So I hope that through working with young people and listening to their voices and empowering the young people who will hopefully be policymakers, they'll be, leading organizations, they'll be teachers, they'll be working in various different places, or wherever it is they choose to have their futures. If we can empower them at this age to feel that they can speak up, so within wherever they're working, to speak up about certain issues, or to place pressure on people that they companies that they work within, or to constantly critically engage with where they are in the world, then I think that's our contribution. And well, not our contribution, but it's a contribution. And I think hopefully if there's traction with lots of contributions, then we won't be in such a dire state. That could happen.
Yeah, so contributions being a kind of message there. So you mentioned, Matt, that you'd like to see this. I mean, you're only in your second year. I'm just kind of conscious that we're kind of coming to the end of our time together. You're in the second year. What's your kind of hope for the future for the Print Prize, and how can people find out about it and get the idea if they want to kind of, reach out to you?
So there's a lady called Molly has just put in the chat a link to the web page. There's there's everything you need to know there. So for the Young London Print Prize, we're going to pick up this theme of climate art and run with it. But I love the way Izzy's expressed that as a contribution. So there's on that web page, there's teachers' resource packs. There's all sorts of stuff you could use if you're involved with young people or working in an education setting. Then there's a load of information there. And please, it's a free resource. Take it, steal it, use it, adapt it in whatever way you want so that just more of this happens. I also think it's quite interesting on an individual level. I think for a lot of us as adults, close down our kind of creative channels a little bit. So there are ways that we can ourselves kind of choose to find ways to respond creatively to the environment. That in itself a form of activism, I think. And my last point would just be that whatever you're involved in the environmental movement, we need to make culture play a much bigger role strategically in all the local climate strategies and net zero carbon pathways and all these things which are suddenly emerging. They're kind of jumping in halfway through without understanding the role of culture to be able to envision what we're trying to do at all. And that's where the arts have a really transformational, powerful role. So in anything you're doing, think about the role that arts and culture can play.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you have any final points on that yourself, Izzy?
No, I agree with Matt. We do what we can do, make our contributions.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. Well, I have learned so much and been inspired so much by hearing from you both today. Thank you so much for joining us at the Festival of Discovery. We have got some further sessions running today. So for anybody who would like to follow what's going on for the rest of the day, please do go to the festivalofdiscovery.com to see what else is in the programme. If anybody has missed this session, thankfully it will live on our Facebook page forever. So your kind of fantastic talk essentially is going to hopefully inspire lots more people to consider the role of art and obviously the power of young people, empowering young people. Absolutely delighted to have had this opportunity to talk to you both today. So thank you very much.
Complete pleasure. Thank you for having us here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.